Have you ever noticed something strange about generational conversations? We argue about boomers. We analyze millennials. We obsess over Gen Z. But there's a generation in the middle that rarely demands attention. They don't brand themselves. They don't complain loudly. They don't announce their philosophy. They just operate. Generation X, those born roughly between the mid-1960s and around 1980, may be the most psychologically underexamined group alive today. And that silence is not accidental. It was trained into them. Imagine being 8 years old. You walk home from school. You unlock the front door yourself. The house is quiet. No phones, no tracking apps, no camera doorbells. Just silence. By the early 1980s, millions of children in the United States were regularly unsupervised after school. This wasn't rare, it was normal. That experience does something to a developing brain. When you're alone that often, you learn quickly that outcomes are your responsibility. If you forget your homework, no one reminds you. If you break something, you deal with it. If you're bored, you solve it. Psychologists describe environments like this as high contingency environments, situations where actions and consequences are tightly linked, with very little buffer. That kind of conditioning wires a person to think ahead. Not dramatically, quietly. You learn to simulate consequences before acting. You anticipate friction. You assume responsibility by default. It doesn't make you louder. It makes you careful. Now layer something else on top of that. Generation X grew up being told that stability was guaranteed if you followed the rules. Work hard. Stay loyal. Do your part. But they also watched layoffs increase. They watched divorce rates climb. They watched institutions make mistakes. When you're told the system is solid, and then you see cracks form, something shifts internally. You don't necessarily become cynical. You become prepared. There's a concept in psychology sometimes referred to as defensive pessimism, mentally rehearsing worst-case outcomes as a way to protect yourself. To outsiders, it can look like skepticism. Internally, it feels like realism. You don't assume the rug will be pulled out from under you, but you don't assume it won't be either. That balance creates emotional armor, not loud pessimism. Controlled expectation. Another difference is harder to see. Gen X grew up in a world where mistakes were local. If you embarrassed yourself, maybe a few classmates knew. That was it. There was no permanent digital archive, so privacy became normal. Not strategic, just natural. When social media arrived, many adapted to it technically, but psychologically, there's often distance. Not because they don't understand technology, but because early experience taught them that visibility carries risk. When you grow up, internalizing that safety comes from keeping certain things close. Broadcasting your life doesn't feel empowering. It feels exposed. There's also a distinct tone you may notice in this generation. Sarcasm, dry humor, ironic detachment. That tone didn't appear randomly. Generation X grew up during the later stages of the Cold War. They participated in nuclear drills at school. They were exposed to constant cultural messaging about instability, while simultaneously being told not to worry. When authority figures signal danger, but instruct calm, the brain adapts. You learn to hold two conflicting ideas at once, and humor becomes a stabilizer. Irony creates emotional distance. It allows you to acknowledge tension without being overwhelmed by it. It's not indifference, it's regulation. Here's where it becomes fascinating. Despite skepticism toward institutions, Generation X developed a powerful work orientation. But it's understated. Many started working young. Paper routes, grocery stores, fast food counters, often handling responsibility that feels unusually adult by today's standards. Those early jobs weren't about building resumes. They were about competence. You showed up. You performed. You fixed mistakes. And because they watched corporate loyalty fail their parents, many internalized a different rule. Don't be loyal to a company. Be loyal to your capability. You can't control economic cycles. You can control your skill. This is why many Gen X professionals quietly invest in becoming highly competent. Not for applause, but for security. They prepare for volatility without dramatizing it. There's a paradox here. Generation X is deeply independent, but they are also quietly collaborative. They don't instinctively ask for help. However, when someone else needs help, they often show up without spectacle. This likely traces back to peer bonding during unsupervised childhood years. When adults weren't around, friendships carried more functional weight. Support wasn't performative, it was practical. You helped because help was needed, not because it would be documented. Their relationship with authority is nuanced. Titles alone don't impress them. Competence does. If a leader demonstrates skill and sound judgment, respect follows naturally. If a leader relies solely on status, skepticism appears quickly. This pattern makes sense when you consider the historical context they witnessed: political scandals, institutional failures, economic volatility. Trust became conditional, not rebellious. Conditional. Many members of Generation X entered adulthood during unstable economic periods. Market crashes, corporate restructuring, recessions. Repeated exposure to economic uncertainty tends to produce one of two reactions: avoidance or diversification. A significant portion chose diversification. Multiple income streams, skill stacking, side projects, not necessarily because of entrepreneurial hype, but because experience taught them that stability is temporary. Preparation is rational, but every strength has a shadow. Research on adult development suggests that Gen X adults are less likely to seek social support during stressful periods compared to some younger cohorts, not because they lack relationships, but because asking for help can feel uncomfortable. When you've solved problems alone since childhood, dependency can register as weakness, even when it isn't. This creates resilience, and sometimes quiet stress. Before instant search engines, information required effort. You searched library catalog drawers. You waited. You took notes by hand. Cognitive psychology shows that effortful learning often creates deeper memory encoding. When knowledge costs time and energy, it embeds differently. That process shapes thinking patterns. There's patience in problem solving. There's tolerance for friction. And there's a belief that solutions exist if you're willing to work for them. Many Gen Xers grew up fixing physical things: bikes, televisions, engines. You didn't immediately outsource problems. You experimented. This builds a subtle internal belief. The world is solvable. It may be complicated, it may be frustrating, but it is solvable. That mindset carries forward into work and life. Generation X occupies a rare position in history. They remember analog childhood and digital adulthood. They understand boredom. They understand pre-internet problem solving. They also built much of the infrastructure that powers today's connected world. They are a bridge generation, and bridges rarely demand applause. They hold weight. They connect eras. They endure stress quietly. Perhaps that's the most defining psychological trait of all. They don't require acknowledgement. They operate. Every generation is shaped by its environment. Generation X was shaped by autonomy, instability, and transition. That combination produced independence, skepticism, competence, and emotional distance. But also resilience. Not better, not worse, just formed under different pressures. And understanding that pressure explains the psychology. If this perspective gave you a new lens, consider subscribing to Alpha Brain Theory. We explore how environment shapes identity and how understanding psychology gives you leverage over your own. Because once you understand the pattern, you can choose how to respond to it.